Okay, so the Earth's been here for a really long time, and it's difficult to get a feel for just how long the Earth has been here. I mean, just try to imagine what a billion is. A billion is 1,000 million. And just to imagine what a million is difficult. So 1,000 million, a billion, and then when we talk about the age of the Earth, almost 5 billion years old, and the age of the universe, about 15 billion years old, it just becomes too much to handle. So we generate these models like this clock model to try to get a better handle on when certain things happen, big events. And that's what we're looking at here. So if you'll notice the color-coded key here, Precambrian time, as we pointed out previously, makes up about 80% of Earth's history. 80% of geologic time is the time before the Cambrian period, which on this model begins right here with the Paleozoic era. The very first period of the Paleozoic is the Cambrian period. And then we get into the Mesozoic era and the Cenozoic era. And that's really where we're going to concentrate our study. That's because that's when most macro animals and plants, macroorganisms lived. Things that can be seen with the naked eye. But life has been here for a lot longer than that. So the very first event that we want to place on here is the very first living things. When did the very first living things appear? And based on molecular fossils, which are just traces of molecules left in the oldest rocks that we can find on the planet, we think that life arose very early after the Earth formed. So here on this model, the Earth forms about 4.8 billion years ago. And within within a billion years, we get the first prokaryotes, we get the first living things. So approximately 4 billion years ago. So less than a billion years after the Earth forms, it's speculated that we get the first life. But there are no rocks on Earth that are that old. It's very difficult to find evidence of when the first life arose because the rock cycle, which recycles rocks, recycles the Earth's crust, has recycled some of the, or almost all of the oldest rocks there are on the planet. So that's an approximation. These squigglies, tildes, or whatever you want to call them before these times that I put in parentheses, they mean approximately. So approximately 4 billion years ago, we get the first living things. And I'm also trying to round off a little bit here to make it a little easier to remember these times. The next big event would be the evolution of oxygenetic photosynthesis. Now, you know that photosynthetic organisms give off oxygen. And that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about the evolution of the ability to photosynthesize. There are different kinds of photosynthesis, and some of the earlier kinds of photosynthesis were thought to not generate oxygen. But then we have the evolution of oxygen-generating photosynthesis, and that starts adding oxygen to the atmosphere. We don't know exactly when that occurred, so I just put it on here, and I didn't put any specific date on here. So you could say around 1.6 or 1.5 billion years ago, we get the evolution of oxygenic photosynthesis. But the important thing here is that's when oxygen started building up, not in the atmosphere, but in the oceans, because these organisms are living in the oceans. And the oceans had to get saturated with oxygen first before it started to build up in the atmosphere. So sometime in this period, the oceans get saturated with oxygen, and then it starts building up in the atmosphere. So that was, and I didn't put a date on this one either because, it's an approximation. It's starting to build up. And it built up gradually over a relatively long period of time. But the significance of that is that it drove the evolution of more complex life. For example, eukaryotic cells. These are cells that have a nucleus. They're different than the prokaryotes that first evolved on the planet that don't have a nucleus. So when you think prokaryote, think bacteria. So bacteria were first. Bacteria-like organisms were first. And it took about 2 billion years for more complex cells to evolve. And it's thought that it's the accumulation of atmospheric oxygen that drove that evolution, that caused that to happen. Then another long period of time, about 1 billion years before we have the first multicellular organisms. And we're talking about algae here. We're not even talking about animals. We're talking about algae. So algae, plant-like protists. Algae can be referred to as plant-like protists because they're in the kingdom Protista. They were the first to be multicellular. Then we have the evolution of the first animals, the first multicellular animals, about 700 million years ago. And that too is speculation to some extent. We have found fossils that are about 600 million years old, and we think that the evolution of animals occurred somewhere before that, maybe even 1 billion years ago back here, but somewhere in here we have the evolution of the first animals. And the problem is that they were soft-bodied. They don't fossilize well. So we can't find many fossils of things that don't have hard parts. But then we have the Cambrian explosion. So here again, at the beginning of the Paleozoic era, right there, about 570 million years ago, we have the Cambrian explosion. And it's called that because we see the appearance of animals in the fossil record because they do evolve hard parts. So soft animals evolved first, then animals started creating things like shells and exoskeletons that fossilize well, and they appear in the fossil record all of a sudden, partly because of that. Then we have the first plants, and plants evolved on land. There's no such thing plants, the definition of a plant is a multicellular photosynthetic organism that lives on land and evolved on land. They have common ancestry with the algae. So the algae evolved back here, and it took this long for plants to move onto land, basically, or for plants to evolve on land, and that was about 470 million years ago. And that allowed for animals to move onto land. So because they had a food source, the land plants gave the animals a food source. And we see the radiation of reptiles about 250 million years ago. That's at the end of the Permian period, the end of the Paleozoic era, and the end of the Permian period. We had that mass dying, the great dying, mass extinction event. And then we see the whole Mesozoic era here represented in green, which was the radiation of reptiles. And then at the end of the Mesozoic, about 65 million years ago, we have another extinction event that removes the reptiles, removes the dinosaurs, basically, not all the reptiles, but removes the dinosaurs, and allows for the radiation of mammals. And then about 200,000 years ago, notice how those time scales are changing here that I'm adding. We go from 1 billion years ago, and then once we get below 1 billion, I switch over to 1 million years ago. But then here, when it comes to the first humans, we have to switch to 1,000 years ago, TYA. So about 200,000 years is all that modern humans have been here, which is basically the blink of an eye. So from the perspective of geologic time, humans have only just arrived. Okay, so here we're looking at how the Earth forms. Now we're going to back up. Now that we've looked at the big picture with that clock model, we're going to back up and take a look at what happened about 4.85 billion or 4.8 billion years ago in the formation of the Earth. So we don't know exactly how the Earth formed or when because no one was there to see it. So all we have is conjecture, evidence, inferences made on evidence that we find that has been found. So the Earth's part of the solar system, so the solar system and the Earth formed at the same time. So the sun formed, and then the planets formed around the sun, and that all happened approximately at the same time. So the Earth and the solar system are about the same age. They formed from a nebula. A nebula is a cloud of gas and dust. And gravity works on that cloud of gas and dust to draw it together to produce a dense core in the middle of the cloud. And that's what it eventually ignites into a star. And then around the star, the planets form by what we call planetary accretion. Planetary accretion is when the bits and pieces that are part of that nebula that are still orbiting the star. So it's only the core of the nebula that ignites into a burning star, and then orbiting that is all the leftover material. And it's that leftover material that undergoes planetary accretion. And again, gravity is working on it in part to pull these pieces together to form larger and larger and larger clumps that eventually accrete into planet-sized, or planetoids is what we would call them first, but then planet-sized chunks. And it took about 100 million years for that to happen. The moon came from what we're looking at in this image. A Mars-sized planetoid slammed into the Earth planetoid, and part of it became part of the Earth, but it also ejected the outer crust that was forming on that Earth planetoid into orbit around the whole thing. And just like the planets accreted from the material that was orbiting the early sun, the material that was orbiting the Earth planetoid accreted into the moon. For about 600 million years after the Earth formed, it was bombarded by, like we're seeing in this image, it was bombarded by, planetary accretion basically continued. In other words, material continued to be added to the Earth planetoid as it formed, because there were still large bodies that were orbiting the sun, and they were being pulled in by gravity by the Earth planetoid. So that we call that period the heavy bombardment. And it kept the Earth molten. So during that time, the Earth was a molten ball of rock. And it remained molten through most of the heavy bombardment. But then the heavy bombardment subsided, and the Earth was able to start cooling to the point where it eventually cooled enough to support liquid water. So when the Earth was molten, it formed the layers that we see making up the interior of the Earth. And it's difficult to know what the interior of the Earth is like because we haven't even drilled all the way through the crust yet. And there are teams working on that right now. But the idea here is that when the Earth was molten, heavy material, heavy matter kind of sank to the core, and lighter material ended up being out towards the crust and even the atmosphere. So what we ended up with is a solid core, solid iron core. Around that is a liquid core made of iron and sulfur. And outside of that is the mantle, which is also liquid, magnesium and iron and aluminum and silicon and oxygen, just to make sure you understand what those elemental symbols are referring to. So again, it took this layered structure because of the density of these different elements, either sinking if they're more dense, or being the less dense elements being out towards the crust and even the atmosphere. We've never even come close to drilling all the way through the crust, let alone reach the core. So we have to infer this structure of the interior of the Earth from other evidence, like earthquake evidence. So here you'll notice that it's labeled here epicenter. So the idea here is that there's an earthquake right here, and there are seismographs, or instruments that measure vibrations of the Earth. And there are seismographs set up all over the world. And so wherever there's an earthquake, the waves from the earthquake are felt or recorded by those seismographs all over the world. And what this diagram is showing is how the waves travel through the Earth and are sensed by those seismographs. And so what's going on here is that the waves are being blocked by something in the center of the Earth. So there's something big, about 1,000 miles across, in the center of the Earth that blocks the earthquake waves from reaching the other side of the planet. And I call this a an earthquake shadow. And it's the same thing as maybe you take a tennis ball and and a flashlight, and you shine the flashlight at the tennis ball. There's going to be a shadow on the other side of the tennis ball. Same thing going on here. The earthquake waves traveling through the earth are blocked by the solid core so that they don't reach the other side of the earth. It's like a shadow. So that's one piece of evidence that tells us that the earth has this solid core. It's also used to explain why the earth has a magnetic field. So this solid iron core and the movement of the magma around the core is responsible for setting up the Earth's magnetic field. And then, as I mentioned, the outermost layer would be the lightest elements, and that would be the gases. So the gases outgassed from inside the Earth. As the Earth cooled and the layers were being set up, the lightest elements were gases that were released from the Earth. That's known as outgassing, and that formed the earliest atmosphere. So here we're looking at the outgassing. The early Earth, an artist's version of the early Earth. We have cooled to the point where there are liquid oceans, but the Earth is still really hot. And we see the moon really big here because the moon, when it first formed, was a lot closer, about 250 million miles closer to the Earth than it is today. But the Earth was still really hot, and the oceans regularly boiled even. But there was liquid water, at least. The first atmosphere was composed of hydrogen and ammonia and nitrogen and carbon dioxide and methane and water vapor, and we know that because that's what comes out of volcanoes today. So if you look at this diagram, it shows what comes out of volcanoes. This diagram also shows, though, oxygen being produced by photosynthetic organisms like this plant, but that wasn't around back at this time. So there was no oxygen in the early atmosphere. It wasn't until oxygenic photosynthesis evolved that we see the beginning of the addition of oxygen, first to the oceans and then to the atmosphere. So with no oxygen, there was also no ozone layer. Oxygen, the oxygen that you're breathing right now is O2. Ozone is O3, and it has the ability to stop ultraviolet radiation. So the consequence of there being no ozone layer on the early Earth, because there was no oxygen to make ozone from, is that there was no ultraviolet radiation protection, UV, ultraviolet, right? So you know today that if you don't wear sunscreen, you may get skin cancer. And that's because of the ultraviolet radiation. So ultraviolet radiation is very damaging to living things. However, back at this time, that was kind of an energy source that may have been important in driving the evolution of life. So due to the lack of oxygen, the first atmosphere is described as being a reducing atmosphere. And you don't need to understand that right now. You'll understand that next year when you take chemistry. But it's a reducing atmosphere. It's not an the word escapes me at the moment. Oxidizing. Yeah, it's not an oxidizing atmosphere. But this is important to the evolution of the molecular evolution. In other words, the evolution of the parts that will come together to form living things. That's referred to as molecular evolution, because molecules evolve just like living things evolve. So the heavy bombardment ended about 600 million years ago after the Earth formed. 600 million years after the Earth formed, not ago. 600 million years after the Earth formed. So about 4 billion years ago, the heavy bombardment ended. The Earth cooled enough for liquid water. So what I'm trying to do here is set the stage. We have the Earth cooling. The heavy bombardment ends. The Earth cools. We have oceans. So we have water. And we have a reducing atmosphere. And those three things come together to allow for the molecular evolution of life. In other words, to allow for the molecules that make up living things to come together and make up living things. That's the easiest way to state that. So how do we know that molecular evolution may have taken place on the early Earth? Well, these two scientists named Stanley Miller and Harold Urey back in the 1950s performed an experiment that we now call the Miller-Urey experiment. And they were the first to show that molecular evolution was possible on the early Earth. So the question they're investigating is, could the organic compounds that form life form on the early Earth? So they were trying to simulate conditions of the early Earth, and they built this apparatus to do that, this chemical apparatus to simulate conditions of the early Earth. And so their null hypothesis, remember there are two kinds of hypotheses. There's the null hypothesis and alternative hypothesis. And in this case, we're going to look at the null hypothesis. If conditions were not right for the evolution of simple organic compounds on early Earth, and we simulate those conditions, which is what Miller and Urey did, then no compounds will form. So that's the null hypothesis. So the apparatus they set up was, they added a heat source because the early Earth was hot. As I mentioned, the oceans regularly boiled, and they simulated the oceans by putting water into the apparatus. That water boiled. Water vapor went into the simulated atmosphere, which also contained the other compounds that we knew, other elements that we knew were in the early atmosphere. We know that because they come out of volcanoes. They come out from inside the Earth today. And they added a spark because there was weather back at this time. So there was lightning. There was also ultraviolet radiation. So either lightning, ultraviolet radiation provided energy, along with the heat provided energy. And then they had a condenser, which is similar, if you know the water cycle, the water vapor rises in the atmosphere and it cools and condenses back into liquid and falls as rain. So this basically simulates rain falling back into the oceans. But they also had a trap here, this curved tube, just like under your sink at home. There's a curve in the drain pipe that acts as a trap. If you accidentally drop something in your drain, you might be able to get it back. You might find it in the crack, like a wedding ring or something. And they also had a valve that they could open and take samples out of the water that was in the trap, or the things that had accumulated in the trap. And the results are that they found simple organic compounds, including fatty acids and amino acids. Now, those are two very important building blocks of living things. And the significant thing also is that this only took a couple weeks. I mean, usually you think of evolution taking millions of years. And yes, big changes do take millions of years. But it looks like it doesn't take that long. And the conditions of the early Earth may have been right for the evolution of these simple organic compounds like fatty acids and amino acids. So what's the big deal about these compounds? Well, amino acids are the building blocks of proteins. And living things are largely made of proteins, and really proteins, as you'll hear me say many times this year, proteins run the show. Proteins do everything. They make up just about everything, and they do everything. Fatty acids are components of lipids. Lipids, like fats and waxes and oils, lipids are significant in living things because they make up cell membranes. There's a plasma membrane, a cell membrane around every cell of every living thing, and that's made up largely of lipids. So these results refute the null hypothesis, and remember, a null hypothesis, it's easier to refute a null hypothesis, and in this case, the null hypothesis was refuted because the null hypothesis said that if conditions were not right for the evolution of simple organic compounds, then no compounds will form, but compounds did form. So this refutes the null hypothesis, suggesting that the conditions of the early Earth may have been right for life. So that's a huge significant result. And also, this is not the only experiment of this type that was ever performed. Remember, one experiment proves nothing. So this experiment has been repeated many times, changing certain variables, because some scientists looked at this critically and skeptically and said, well, maybe those weren't the conditions of the early Earth. Maybe you got the conditions wrong. Well, even if they changed the conditions, certain conditions to match what they thought the early Earth may have been like, we still get the same thing. We still get organic compounds being formed. We've also found organic compounds on asteroids and comets. So it turns out that the building blocks of life, the molecular evolution of the building blocks of life, probably take place not only on the Earth, but outward into our solar system, and probably outward into the universe even. So the building blocks of life may be very common all over the universe. So now that we know it was possible for the building blocks of life to be around on the early Earth, the question is, how did those components come together to form cells? Well, again, one of the primary structures of a cell is the cell membrane, the plasma membrane that surrounds the cell. And there are very simple compounds that can come together to form a plasma membrane-like structure, a cell membrane-like structure. So we call them proteinoid microspheres, which are cell-like structures that form when certain proteins interact with water. And there are also liposomes, which are cell-like structures that form when certain lipids interact with water. So here on the left we see proteinoid microspheres made up primarily of protein, and on the right there are liposomes made up primarily of lipids. And if you were to look at these under the microscope, you might guess they were cells, but there's nothing inside these structures. They're very simple, just almost like empty containers, empty cell containers. But these are similar to the plasma membranes that surround all living cells. The two compounds that make up the plasma membranes or cell membranes of all living cells are phospholipids and proteins. And both proteins and phospholipids on their own can form plasma membrane-like structures, but it appears that these two compounds combined to form the cell membranes that we find around living things today. So we call this thing a protocell. We call, the first cell-like structures are referred to as protocells, kind of like a prototype, right? If you're inventing something, you might have a prototype that is a model or represents the very first one, the very first of whatever you're inventing that you created. That's a prototype. Well, these things are referred to as protocells, the very first cell-like structures that ever formed. And they found that they are capable of performing a few basic cellular functions. Even though they're kind of like empty cells, they can still carry out certain cellular functions. One of them being the ability to store energy, another to perform enzymatic reactions, and even reproduce, sort of. It's kind of like if you have well, you know that oil floats on top of water, so if you put one of these liposomes on, find one of these liposomes floating on the top of water, you can very easily split it into two liposomes. So that's kind of the rudimentary reproduction we're talking about. So now that we have something that looks like a cell, has a plasma membrane, living things also all living things today contain DNA, contain genetic information. So how did that evolve? Because without genetic information, there is no life. Well, first, a reminder that simple organic compounds formed from inorganic matter on the early Earth was possible. That was shown by the Miller-Urey experiment. So we have the components of life. And we also have this hypothesis known as the RNA world hypothesis. And, so I'm sure you're familiar with DNA as being the genetic material of life. And DNA is made up of genes. And there's a hypothesis, there's another kind of DNA-like molecule called RNA. And RNA is simpler than DNA in a number of ways. So there's a hypothesis that RNA was first, and the other thing about RNA is it can do all the things that DNA can do, and that's what I'm trying to show with this diagram. This represents RNA. So back when this genetic information was first evolving, RNA could do everything. RNA can make proteins. That's what we're seeing on this arrow. RNA can copy itself, make more RNA, and DNA can be made from RNA. So RNA can do everything. And so it's speculated that RNA was first because of that. And then later, DNA evolved as a more stable way to store the genetic information and more reliable way to copy that information and pass that information on to offspring eventually. But one thing that RNA does more frequently than DNA is mutate, because it's less stable. So again, DNA probably evolved as a more stable way to store genetic information. So RNA mutates much more than DNA does. But because of that, it introduces a lot of variation. And you know that variation is the raw material of natural selection and evolution. So RNA probably evolved quickly. Because it mutates so much, it probably evolved quickly. It was subject to molecular molecular natural selection. So that's kind of the idea of molecular evolution, that molecules can evolve just like living things, just like species and populations can evolve. So although RNA can do it all, DNA probably evolved, like I said, as a more stable way to store and copy the genetic information. RNA is not considered alive. It doesn't have all the characteristics of life. If you'll recall, back at the beginning of the year, we looked at all the characteristics, and the idea is that to be considered alive, you have to have all the characteristics of life. And yeah, RNA has a few characteristics of life, like it can replicate itself, but that's about it. So now that we have cell structure and cellular information, we really have everything that's needed to have the first living things. And the first living things, fossils of the first living things are really hard to come by. They would be microfossils because cells are microscopic. So you have to use a microscope to see them. And these images represent some of the oldest fossils that we've found that appear to be bacteria. And not just bacteria, but a certain kind of bacteria known as cyanobacteria that is able to produce oxygen. It's able to photosynthesize and produce oxygen. However, just because these look like cyanobacteria doesn't necessarily mean they are cyanobacteria. It doesn't necessarily mean they do photosynthesize, but they definitely look like some form of early cellular life. So the significance of the fossil find here is that oxygen, it may represent the beginning of oxygen production. So if this represents the earliest oxygen production, that means that oxygen production may have begun about 3.465 billion years ago, or about 3.5 billion years ago. And as I mentioned previously, the oxygen first dissolved in the oceans. So, as soon as oxygen started being produced by photosynthetic life, it didn't go directly into the atmosphere. It built up in the oceans for millions of years and combined with iron and formed iron oxide, which you know as rust. And that built up in these thick deposits that we now dig up as iron ore. So if you're in an iron mine, what they're digging up is iron ore, which formed during this time. The iron ore that's being dug up is basically iron oxide that was formed when oxygen first started being added to the oceans, and it combined with iron to form those thick deposits of iron oxide. Free oxygen is the term we use to refer to O2 in the atmosphere, oxygen gas that is available both in the oceans and the atmosphere. So oxygen continued to dissolve in the oceans until the water eventually became saturated. In other words, all the iron was removed from the ocean water, basically, combined with oxygen, sank to the bottom, built up as iron oxide deposits. But then free oxygen was available in the water, but eventually, water can only hold so much free oxygen, and that free oxygen then started being released into the atmosphere. So about 2.2 billion years ago, the ocean saturation allowed for oxygen release into the atmosphere, and oxygen started building up in the atmosphere. But that took a long time too, millions of years. So the thing about oxygen is it's a very reactive compound. It will tear things up. It's oxidizing, right? Remember, it was important that the early atmosphere be a reducing atmosphere, because oxygen wasn't around. It wasn't an oxidizing atmosphere. An oxidizing atmosphere would have torn up the simple organic compounds that were first formed. So it's really significant that it was a reducing atmosphere when the molecules, the building blocks of life, first evolved through molecular evolution. But with the addition of oxygen now, because oxygen is such a reactive element, it actually killed a lot of the first cells that evolved because they couldn't handle the oxygen. A lot of those early prokaryotic organisms were killed by the oxygen. But some species survived and evolved. They evolved the ability to handle the oxygen. Again, this buildup of oxygen was very slow, both in the oceans and the atmosphere. So this slow buildup allowed for the evolution of life to keep up with that change. So gradual change, life usually will evolve and adapt to. Quick change, fast change, life might have a harder time adapting to, evolving adaptations for. So, for example, climate change. We're really worried about climate change happening so fast that most of the species on the planet won't be able to adapt.